Hello, humans and puppies on the internet. My name is Brett, and this is my show. I do this every Thursday, and we talk about mostly containers and things like Docker, but also any DevOps topic, any sysadmin, cloud, developer, deployments, all the things tech when it comes to running stuff on the internet, basically, and maybe sometimes in your data center. So if you haven't been here before, the format of this show is that I start out with some announcements and we talk a little bit about the stuff that's gone on this week or interesting projects and things I've seen lately. Then we get to your questions. So get your questions in early. I answer them in top-down format. This takes about an hour, so we have fun here, hopefully. That's why you're here. A little bit of entertainment, a little bit of knowledge. And if you aren't able to watch this whole video, don't worry, just leave your browser open. You can always come back and rewind the fancy DVR called YouTube, or you can watch this video later because it gets posted to this channel. So if you aren't able to hang out, or if you maybe post a question and you're not able to hear the answer because you've got other important things to do, then just come back here later or click the subscribe button and come back and watch the video. You can sometimes see clips of this show in my new podcast, which I'll give you the link to in a minute, that came out earlier this year, as well as clips that sometimes show back up in this channel. So if you ask a good question that I have a good answer to, then sometimes that shows up in other places. The format of this is really mostly based out of my students asking all great questions in the courses I teach. And that stuff can be found at this URL here, server there. There you have access to my best coupons for my 2 courses and then my upcoming courses, all right now focused around the Docker toolkit. So let's get started. So get your questions in the Slack, or not in the Slack, get them into YouTube chat, because that's the only one I'm checking for this live stream. And I will answer them in order here in a little bit. And up first, let's talk about my little list of URLs, which if you've been here before, you've heard me talk about. All right. So at that URL you saw just a while ago, brettfisher.com/Docker, that is all of my Docker resources. The latest one that was added a little over a month ago was my new podcast, which is nothing but clips from this show. So if you see up at the top there, if you just go to brettfisher.com/podcast, or if you just go to this website and click the link, you can get access to my podcast on all the podcast networks, iTunes, Spotify, just you name it. It's on all the places that I can find, at least. So I'd love to hear feedback on that, and whether you're listening to that show or like that show. It looks like I have at least 300 subscribers to that, so great. I'm excited that people are actually interested in that. And then, of course, other things I have here are my courses, currently Docker and Swarm, and coming soon node.js, which I've been saying soon for quite a while now. But our goal is to get that launched here before DockerCon. Speaking of DockerCon, that is coming up in about a month in San Francisco. And if you're interested in going, then you can use my coupons. So I will just give you the link to the website. Let's see, 10% off using Captain Brett as the coupon code. I don't get anything for that. That's just them giving me a way to get you a discount. Now, coming in the next couple of weeks before DockerCon, I think I announced this last week, I'm going to have some guests and possibly some other things going on. There's lots of stuff I'm working with Docker on to share with you about DockerCon, and possibly some other discounts and other things, possibly even this show being on their channel on YouTube in the next couple of weeks. So we'll see if that all pans out. There's no sort of secrets there, but not sure how everything's going to lay out and how everything's going to happen. We may do extra shows on extra days. We may just stick with the Thursday. So the way you know about all of that is step one, you subscribe to this channel, click that little bell next to the subscribe so that you get notified when I go live. And the other thing is to get on my newsletter, which you can see in the description of this video. It's also on my Docker page over here. It's just brettfisher.com/newsletter. And I send out any major announcements rather infrequently. So it's not, you're not going to get spammed on that list. That list is very low volume, and it's usually just major stuff that's going on and things that I have to share that I think would be helpful for you. If you're in the DevOps space, learning containers, learning sysadmin, and how to deploy software. All right, so at DockerCon this year, they rekindled the open source summit situation. It used to be called Moby Summit. If you've ever been to DockerCon, it's a dedicated day. In past years, it's turned into a track, and then this year it's back to being a dedicated day, just focused on the open source that Docker is building or helping with. And that's pretty exciting because if you scroll down the page, one of the things on there, besides awesome things like Kubernetes and security and Docker app, which is a new tool for using compose files in production, and CNAB, the standard behind the new Docker app, and BuildKit, which is amazing ways to build new images and with all sorts of new features. But if you keep scrolling down, you see SwarmKit, which is exciting because we didn't get a lot of announcements last year at DockerCon around the future of Swarm. I put out a very lengthy blog post that you can find at brettfisher.com. Of course, that's where I put everything. You can find a very lengthy post there about what's going on in Swarm and what was going on in 2018, late 2017. I haven't yet updated it for 2019, even though we've seen some new stuff already released. We saw just a month ago, Docker released Docker Stacks. And Docker Stacks is a new API on top of SwarmKit that gives you the stack feature. If you've ever used Swarm and you've ever typed in Docker stack deploy, that is technically using command line features in the CLI, not a server API. So if you've ever been a developer wanting to automate or make some really cool stuff on top of the Stacks functionality, because it is pretty great, you didn't have that in the server and you sort of had to build all that logic yourself. But what they've done here is they've built a container that runs the Stacks API. This is a new API they're using to extend the Docker API. And my assumption is that this will start to be built into the next release of Docker. We don't really know that, but for now, this is a standalone container that you simply run on your Docker Swarm, and then that API endpoint would give you Stacks functionality in the API on top of Docker's and Swarm's API. So if you're familiar with Kubernetes, this is very similar to how Kubernetes works, where it has APIs that run as containers on your Docker container engine or your container engine of choice. And so this is something that Docker has done in this case. I think that's, my guess is to really just get it out there and to provide this functionality and feature set. This complements, or at least it doesn't necessarily complement, but it coincides with Compose on Kubernetes, which is an interesting discussion. We talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago when Michael Irwin was on the show. He talked about Docker app, but Compose on Kubernetes is another Docker tool that uses that same Stacks file. Technically, it's called the Compose format, but that Stacks file that you would use in Swarm, you can now use on Kubernetes. So what Docker is really doing is it's circling the wagons of all of its tool set around the Compose file. So if you've ever doubted the future of the Compose file and whether or not you're going to be able to use it everywhere, I think that's Docker's goal eventually, is that this is a very high-level abstraction that we use for local development. We can use it in CI/CD testing, and now for a while now, been able to use it with Swarm for at least 2 years with Swarm Stacks, and now we can use it with open source tooling on top of Kubernetes, as well as now the Swarm getting the Stacks API, and we have Docker app, which is also going to be talked about at the Open Source Summit. And that Docker app is that command line tool that allows you advanced functionality around using stack files. And that is at github.com/docker/app. So if you're new on your container journey, these are probably tools that you want to save till later. Once you're really comfortable with the Compose format and you're using Docker Compose locally, just do that stuff first. But eventually, once you need to start worrying about your servers and how you're going to get stuff on those servers. If those servers are Swarm, then you would be excited, maybe, especially if you're a developer who's going to program against your orchestrator. You might be excited about the Docker stacks. I'll put that in the Slack. I keep saying Slack. This isn't Slack. This is YouTube. And then you might be interested in Docker app regardless of what you use, because Docker app allows you to bundle up your Compose files, and this is key. It allows you to bundle up your Compose files and then push them to a registry. The reason that we care about that, and we talked about a couple of weeks ago, is that you can now make your Compose files, or your deployment instructions is essentially what that is. How many containers, what kind of environment settings do these containers need, what images am I using, all the different settings for all your different containers in your app. You can now make that an artifact for deployment. And you don't need to store it. Well, you should store it in Git, but you don't need to tell your servers to go get it from Git. They can now get versions of these Compose files, just like they can with their images, from a registry using the Docker app tooling. And that is now built in the Docker Hub. So if you go to Docker Hub, you can find Compose files essentially in images. There's nothing else really in the image other than some metadata. The Compose file doesn't go with your app. Your app sticks with your Docker file. It stays in its own image. The Compose file is just using that image format for distributing the Compose file as an artifact, meaning that you can do an Docker app deploy and Compose file using an image name. So if I was using the popular voting app, I could just say something like, app. It's actually called Docker app right now, but Docker app deploy and my image name. So that might be brettfisher.com or brettfisher/ voting app or something like that. And that would deploy the Compose file to my servers, whether that's Kubernetes or Swarm. And then that Compose file would then tell the server, I want this image for the front end. I want this image for the database. I want these environment settings. I want these volumes and these networks, right? All that stuff that you would have in Compose. So a lot of questions I get from people is, once I get my cluster set up and I want to deploy my images, how do I get my Compose files on the server so that I can run the server commands? And the answer to that now is you use Docker app. You don't do it on the server. You do it remotely, usually through the CLI, and you connect to the server remotely. And then you just run Docker app commands to deploy these as images. Now, this is for fancy team setups, right? If you're just a solo developer, a hobbyist, you're probably not going to use a lot of these tools unless you're sharing your Compose files and your container apps with other people. One of the big questions I get for people is, if I have an app that I want to share with the world, and maybe it's 3 different containers, right? 10 different containers, whatever it is. How do I share the Compose file with everyone else? I don't want them to have to go to GitHub and git clone my repo just to get the Compose file to deploy their app. And the answer is, again, Docker app. That's this format, the image as the artifact to deploy. So now if you have a server and a database, a web server database, WordPress, right? You can now deploy that with an image name using the Docker app tooling. Now, hopefully, eventually, we're going to have Docker app built into the Docker command line. These will all eventually get bundled into the Docker command line. You'll always be able to use them separately because it is open source. But if you are someone who uses the Docker CLI, that maybe this stuff will all be built in out of the box. So enough about that. If you're going to come to DockerCon, there's going to be great sessions on that. If you're more interested in Docker app, look on this channel back a couple of weeks for a video that says guest Michael Irwin, who's also Docker captain, and he talks and gives examples and demos on Docker app and how to use these new tools and format. All right, so a couple of other pieces of news beyond DockerCon. Docker won some awards from computing, the DevOps Excellence Awards, which there's so many award things out there that I don't really follow them all, but this one is interesting mostly because, one, I don't necessarily, let's see, let me click. Oh, interesting. Now it's behind a paywall. All right, so They hid this report, and it's no longer available, I guess. The other week when I came here, it was on. So Docker basically won the best DevOps tool or something for Docker Enterprise. And I was going to give you the list because I thought it was interesting that there's some tools on there that I not heard of. I thought maybe you could give your opinion on tools that you had tried, but it's now hidden and I don't have an account, so I'm not going to look at that. All right. The next little piece of news is about Portworx. So if you're interested in container storage, Portworx should be on your short list, especially if you're talking about production, business type of infrastructure. One of your big problems is once you get stuff into containers, the containers are going to be moving around servers, assuming you're using some sort of orchestration. And that means that you are going to need some sort of persistent storage. That's the storage for your databases and other things that you need to keep long term. And usually people start out and then they realize very quickly that out of the box Docker provides the local driver, and that local volume driver really just means storing the files on the local system that your container is running on. It doesn't move those files around between servers. It doesn't store those servers off the disk, although you certainly could use NFS or something like that to do that. So you usually need a volume driver. And this comes out of the box. There's third-party ones. You can get them at Docker Hub. If you just go to hub.docker.com, there's a whole list of them there. And one of the commercial offerings is Portworx. And what's interesting is that I have only used Portworx in my demos or sort of playing around with it. I haven't had any, I haven't had any customers that I've worked with directly that use Portworx. I have had students actually tell me that they're using Portworx and it works great. Portworx does multiple things, but one of the things it can do is manage your storage and the different types of storage, and it does other things like replication. And so you should check it out. If you're interested at all in running containers in production in a cluster, Portworx should be something you should check out. The cool thing is they just recently got a big funding round, which is good for the future of the company. They talked also about, in this article, which I will send into chat, they talked also about their big customers, some of the customers they've got, and stuff like that. So if you're interested in that, because the problem with the storage industry right now is it's in a state of flux, like everything else in container worlds, and there's tools out there that you maybe don't feel completely comfortable with because you're not really sure how solid the project is, you're not sure if it's going to be around in 2 years. And so it's great to see storage companies getting funding and getting new customers, big accounts and stuff like that, because storage is really hard. To get enterprise storage right in containers is very difficult for a company to do, and it's hard for them to make money on it. So it's great that Portworx is actually figuring out how to do that. So check them out. They have a volume plugin that works with Swarm and Kubernetes. So either way you go, even if you just use plain old Docker, they also can help as well. All right, and I love to talk about jobs here because we're all in search of the next job, the better paying job, the better boss. So every week I try to share a little something about jobs, and I'm turning to the DevOps from Chris, which I've mentioned before, newsletter. And if you just search Chris Short, you'll find chrisshort.net. And he has a great newsletter in case you're interested in DevOps newsletters. He has a great one there that you can find on his website. It's called DevOps-ish. And I will put that in the chat. He does good stuff. And he works for, I believe he works for Red Hat. Yeah. And anyway, he posted about this top 5 ways or 5 ways to boost your earning potential with DevOps. And honestly, I kind of agree with it. I think that one of the keys in here that a lot of people don't talk about, because obviously certification, learning new things, those are always going to be on there. But developing your personal brand, and it's a weird little title. I'll kind of zoom in on that. But what I really take from this is if I search you on the internet and I find nothing, that's not a good thing, right? Now, if you're a security professional and you're trying to be secretive and you're trying to, get a top secret clearance and you don't want anyone to know about you on the internet, that's great. But that's not the world of DevOps. DevOps is about sharing knowledge, learning from others, and I would argue even the world of security when it comes to DevOps and computing, so we call that DevSecOps. That is a world now becoming more of sharing, more open source, more community, which means that you need to be out there. You need to create a blog and talk about what you're working on. Put some of the stuff you're working on in GitHub and make it open source. Even if it's just simple little things like compose files or Docker files. Because if you haven't already had a job interview where they want you to show off your work, you're going to eventually have a job interview where they're going to want you to show off your work. And if you have nothing to show because everything is at your last company, and that stuff is probably protected, so you can't necessarily share that, you're going to need to create some stuff on your own. Might be a PowerPoint slide that you maybe talked at a local meetup. You can always find local meetups. Most major cities have them. Even small cities now in the US have meetups where you can go and talk. You can learn from others. You can ask to do a lightning talk, which is a 7-minute little talk. Even if you're not comfortable with it, that's how I got started. Little short talks to small groups of people. And maybe just 5-10 slides. And you start sharing that stuff out, right? There's always places to share all this stuff. And that way, when a future employer wants to learn about you, they might do a background check as a part of the company. But I bet you that manager is going to probably just Google your name. And let's see what they find out, right? Hopefully, there's something on the internet. It doesn't have to be social media if you're not a social media fan. It just needs to be something about your job that you're willing to share. In fact, nowadays, you don't even have to run your own blog. You can use places like Medium, medium.com, stuff like that. And of course, GitHub and Bitbucket, but mostly just GitHub for sharing, code, readmes on things, just you name it. There's always something that you have that other people are interested in learning. So I recommend that that's the thing this year that you do. If you're looking to get into DevOps or you're already there and you want to climb up the ladder, put something else out there. Open source something on your own on GitHub, even if it's just a single file that you think might be valuable to someone, even if it's a gist. And a gist is kind of like GitHub's copy-paste situation, right? Even if it's just a little script that you use to install Docker. Put something else out there because it's infectious, right? The first time you do it, it's kind of cool. The first time you get someone that likes it, that's really fun. And then you just grow from there. You add new stuff, you try out new stuff. And so that was the big one for me. There's lots of stuff on here on this list. Automation, automating things is important. That's a nature. That's sort of the ground zero of DevOps is automation, right? And that's it for my talks today. The things I have to talk about today, the things I have to share. So now this is the point where we get to the questions, which I see are just blowing up and people are having full-on conversations in there, and that's great. So I'm going to start all the way up at the top and work my way down the list, and we'll see if we can find some good questions that I have answers to. All right, so first up, is there a way to build and run containers from Git monorepo? I mean, multiple containers. I am writing multiple services in Go and do that in a monorepo, and now it's time to incorporate some automation. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you have other people there also answering your questions, Alexandra. Yes, definitely you can do that. You basically could just clone a repo down, move to the directory where you want that Docker file, and then do a Docker build. Your Docker files don't have to be called Docker file. The default name that Docker will use when you do a Docker build is looking for a file called Docker file, but you can call it, container file. You can call it whatever you want. Container build, you can make your own standard, and then when you do a Docker build, you're going to specify a -f to find the file that you want it to call. This is also true of Docker Compose. If Docker Compose has a default file name, but you can always use -f to specify whatever file you want. And with Docker files, remember the thing about Docker files is the directory that you're in for the context, which is that last little thing that you do in a Docker build command. For instance, if you do let's just zoom in. If you do a Docker build and look at the help, the last little thing there is the path. So ideally, whatever the path is or the context for where you're building it, that's where the Docker file will start doing its work from. And so sometimes I get a question where people say, I want to include files in my Docker image that are in a completely different path, like up my directory chain. And that's not something that Docker build does, because when you specify that path or location for where you're going to start building, Docker will, if you see it at the beginning of a Docker build, it will take all the files in that directory and all subdirectories and put them into a tarball and then push them to the Docker engine, wherever that is. If that might be your local machine, that might be a server that's remote. And so if there's a file that you're trying to copy in from somewhere else, it's never going to get that file. So make sure that when you're doing this, that you're always building that context from the directory you want. Like if your Go apps are in their own subdirectories, that's fine. Just do a Docker build, specify the file name, and then specify that directory as the build path at the end there, and you'll be good. Good question. Next up, how can I handle SSL cert? Let's see. Santiago says, how can I handle SSL cert for Nginx in local environment, dev environment, to prod for HTTPS? Yes, so locally, you just need to create your own certs. If you're going to do local development, then what I would probably do is use Nginx or Traffic or something like that inside your compose file. And that way you can have URLs and pass those back to your app, right? And you can look up, Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt has a good article on certificates for localhost. And they give you the whole background on why you shouldn't get wildcards or why you shouldn't go use a Let's Encrypt for localhost traffic. And that you really should just generate them, store them on your local machine, and bind mount them into your containers at runtime. Use Docker Compose to bind mount those certificates into your running containers, and that way you'll always have a trusted certificate. Now, if you use the same certificate all the time, and this is what I do, then you can store it outside your project, somewhere on your local machine, and then you can tell your browsers to trust it. So if you're using the name that matches the certificate, if you create the certificates with the name localhost on your local machine, and then you use those in your compose file for your proxies, and then you tell your browsers to trust that certificate, then you have a great local development environment that is always going to work. It's not going to give you warnings, and your browsers will trust it. You don't necessarily need to go get third-party certificates because those don't work for local machines. They're not designed for local machines. And I wouldn't necessarily share these certificates out. There's no reason to really share them. They're easy to create. So to me, it's kind of like an SSH key. You just keep it on your local machine. You might even just keep it in your .ssh folder or create one called .cert in your profile on your local machine and just store them there and link to them in your compose files so that you will always have them when you need them inside of your proxies or any web servers that you want to have SSL locally. Now, of course, in production, that's a totally different deal. If you're talking about Docker Swarm, for instance, I like to use Let's Encrypt with Traffic, which Traffic is a front-end proxy that works like Nginx in that way. And I have a repo called Dogs versus Cat that has an example of that. I'll also throw that in here for you. That repo has an example of how to use a traffic proxy with Let's Encrypt, so it'll automatically go get your certificates and bring them back. Now, if you want to go buy your own certificates like we traditionally used to do, that's fine too. You could store those in secrets in Swarm. If you're using Kubernetes, you could also store them in secrets, and that way they'd be available for whatever containers you need. Hopefully that helps, and good question. Okay, so Dezinters, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, sorry about that. Yeah, coming back and talking about your building question, but only build on tasks, tags or something, only those got changes because rebuilding all 50 containers would be disaster. Yeah, so that's going to get a little more complicated. You're going to have to build some intelligence into your CI platform Because if you're just depending on standard webhooks coming out of something like GitHub to notify your CI engine to build what's in there, then it's not going to know what changed, right? So maybe your build tool is going to search for something inside, maybe it waits for a specific release instead of just every commit. Or maybe you commit on different branches or something like that. That's actually not even really a Docker question, because really the question you're asking is, how do I have my CI solution do different things on the same repo for different commits, right? So you want your CI to have intelligence inside the commit so that it acts differently based on what changed in that commit. And that can be a little tricky. That's going to be based on your CI solution and what kind of scripts or automation you can set up there. Obviously, at the end of the day, having those all as their own repos would be the easiest thing to do. There's not always a reason to do that if you can find the intelligence inside your CI solution to do that. But really, if you think about it, that's not a Docker-specific question. That's really a CI automation question and how it relates to Git and Git commits. So I don't have an answer for that off the top of my head, because that would kind of depend on each system, and I'd have to research each system and what different ways you could solve that problem on each system. You could wait until you do tags on your, Git commits. You could maybe look for keywords in the commit message to only do things. A lot of those things, though, I feel like would there'd be a problem, because they're things that developers tend to forget, right? When they're making commits, they're going to forget those things. And then the build solution wouldn't build it. The CI wouldn't see those tags or those messages. And how many times we all forget on GitHub to type in fixes, number 57 or whatever when we're submitting a commit that fixes an issue. I always forget that. And so then you have to go manually close the issue. So that might not be the best solution for your problem. But if you find out a good solution, come back on the show, find me on Twitter, let me know what you figured out, or if you found a good article on how to solve that with your particular solution. I love to learn from everyone else, so tell me how you did it. Let's see. Arish, sorry if I mispronounced that. I am not sure if I can ask this or not. What are your thoughts about the Elastic Stack for microservice monitoring? Do you like and would you suggest any alternatives for extremely dynamic environments? For monitoring, for microservice monitoring. So I'm not an ELK expert, but I only use it for ELK logging. I don't use it for monitoring, stuff like that. And it does a good job at logging for container solutions, because each container, when you start it up, you can specify where it's going to point its logs to. And then you can make the container name a part of that information, so ELK will store that, and you can search and aggregate that stuff in ELK over time. I don't know about their monitoring solutions. So to me, logging and monitoring are two separate parts of the tool chain, and to me, ELK solves logging. They probably have other products that I don't know about, so I don't really have a good answer there. In terms of if you're just really asking about logging, what alternatives there are lots of other alternatives. There are paid alternatives like Datadog. There's that do monitoring and logging all in one. There's logging solutions like Loggly or Papertrail. If you want to look those up, Papertrail is my favorite just because it's easy, it's single purpose focused, it just does logging, and it's really good at that. And I've used it for years. So that's Papertrail. All right, good question. Next one. Up next, the question, please also share your thoughts about the new version of Kubernetes if you checked. I have not. I saw the announcements. I read the feature set and the new stuff in the release, but I haven't had much chance to play with it myself. I'm busy, unfortunately, finishing up a course, and then I'm going to be ramping up for DockerCon here next month. But I do hope to get some time this summer. I do plan to have some time to look into that, to test it out, and I'm sure we all love new features. So as long as they're not extremely buggy, we all love to play with new stuff. So I don't have a lot of thoughts on that. But ask me in a few months. All right. Rudy says, thank you for providing this helpful channel. Do you have a practical guide for CD/CI? I saw CodeShip has one, but doesn't offer much in-depth details. All I would like to learn is how to move my containers from my DigitalOcean server to my local host, make changes, and then deploy them back to DigitalOcean to have it publicly available. This is a Flask app and PostgreSDB. Yeah, and so I can see other people are asking or responding to your questions. So yeah, moving containers off server, that sounds like an odd workflow and makes me think that maybe you're storing data in your containers and you shouldn't be. So containers themselves shouldn't have any unique data in them. You should be able to throw containers away. Volumes are where you want to keep your persistent data. So if you're talking about SQL data, then really Docker doesn't solve that problem for you. You can try to use Docker tools in sort of what I would consider a bad way to store and move with images, move your databases around, but that is not what it's designed to do. That is not really an effective workflow. It causes potential problems down the line. So if you have SQL data, then you need to look at traditional SQL tools for getting that data in and out, right? You need to look at either remotely connecting with SQL commands or a SQL GUI of some sort, and then maybe extract it out, or using command lines inside your containers that do exports or dumps of your SQL data, and then bring that data down your machine, either through SSH, like SCP, which is an SSH copy protocol, or some other method, and then importing those on your local machine. And in terms of exporting and importing, you're probably just going to be using the command line tools or a GUI, if you prefer GUIs, that come with your database of choice, and then just copying those back and forth. Docker isn't meant to really move data around. It's focused on moving application code around. So at the end of the day, there's code and there's data, and Docker focuses on code. For moving data around, you're probably going to need something else. And of course, I'm sure that there are people on the edges there that have come up with all sorts of creative ways to move data around using Docker. But I would say that's not mainstream. That's not necessarily well documented. And CI/CD is really about taking your source code from your developers or your apps that you're making or testing locally, getting those up into a registry by building them and testing them, and then pushing them to the registry once that's done. And then on your production servers, downloading those images and running them, right? Updating your containers with new images and restarting new containers off of those images. That's really the path, the typical path of CI/CD. It's not a two-way street. It's typically a one-way street, except in rare cases of where you need to troubleshoot and you need to maybe you need to commit an actual running container to an image for troubleshooting purposes and then get it off the server and then run it locally. You can do that using something called Docker commit. If you look up the Docker commit command, that allows you to save a special image. But that's really sort of a one-off use case for troubleshooting, not a typical workflow. So hopefully I've given you some tips on that. The real challenge with CI/CD is that there are 1,000 ways and 1,000 tools, right? We all have different workflows. And that's why when you look at workflow tools, which really that's what CI/CD tools are, is they're a workflow tool, that they're really an open template. They give you a bunch of knobs to turn, and you get to turn the knobs whichever way you want, right? And you get to turn on things the way you want to do them. I would say that for most people, I could probably sum up the streamlined CI/CD path is that you have software in a Git registry, whether that's GitHub or Bitbucket or something like that. You have it in a Git repo, not registry. You have that source code there. Then when you commit, that system does a webhook and tells your build system, your CI/CD system, to build and test that image. And if that goes well and all your tests have passed and the building worked, then that system should be pushing it up to your Docker image registry. That might be Docker Hub, that might be GitLab, it might be AWS, it could be 1,000 different places. Everybody has their own registries now, and you can run your own for free. So then you're storing it in the registry, and then you need some sort of automation there, or just a human that does a manual thing when you want your images to be updated on your servers. So you would go to your servers and do Docker pull and Docker run, stuff like that. Or if you're using orchestration, you might use a compose file or a Kubernetes deployment file. Or if you're using full automatic CI/CD, then you need some sort of webhook set up so that your Jenkins or CodeShip or you name it, code deploy, like I said, there's 1,000 tools there. You need for those to push and update your images in production. And so the trick is on any sort of CI/CD course is to not get too focused on the tool they're using, but the workflow, the end-to-end workflow, and then you might decide to use a different tool, right? We don't all need to use Jenkins. We don't all need to use CodeShip or Code Deploy or GitLab or you name it, right? There's Drone, there's GoCI. I think it's GoCI. There's just so many tools that you could use for your automation of CI/CD. There's different deployment methodologies. You could use webhooks. You could use SSHing to SSH into your servers and then do it that way. So there's lots of stuff there. And no, I unfortunately don't have a guide on that. I would say that if you looked up the Docker ways to do this, if you go over to the Success portal, so if you go to success.docker.com and you look up stuff like, I think CI/CD, let's see what happens there. And then we go to maybe guides. No. And then maybe look at, let me see if I can find guides here. My point here is that there are guides on the Docker Success website. They have reference architectures here, and you might have to do a little looking around. But I have seen diagrams that show the workflow of CI/CD here. It's not always obvious and easy to find. They do a lot of tagging, so you might look around for tags of things you want to look for, stuff like that. So you might want to check that out. Success.docker.com. Good question. All right, a question from Biker. Any downside to putting an SFTP server in a container so our developers can push files directly to a mount available through each of the Swarm hosts, so we don't run a server on the host directly? No, there's no downside to that at all. The challenge, of course, depending on what type of SFTP you're talking about, is sometimes maybe ports and NATing, but that's just a networking thing. That's a common problem whether or not you're using Docker. I would definitely, if I needed to have developers SFTP stuff up to servers, yeah, putting it in containers, absolutely the right way to go, I think. There's probably images out there. You've probably already looked at them. I haven't run any of those myself, so yeah. A container is a great place for a long-running task like that, and that way when a new version of your SFTP tool comes out, you can just deploy it as a new image and replace it on those servers. Good question. Let's see, what else we got? Almost caught up. Aspen asks, do you do consults at DockerCon? Would love to get some feedback on a project we're working on. Great question. So at DockerCon every year, they have something called the hallway track. And the hallway track allows small groups of people or individuals to get together in a big open area and meet and hang out and learn stuff. What I do every year at DockerCon, unfortunately due to my schedule at DockerCon, I'm not able to meet with people individually. But what I do is at least once, hopefully twice, I have sessions at the hallway track. So if you've already got your ticket, I'm not sure if they've sent out emails about hallway track yet, but if not, they will soon, that allow you to sign up for hallway tracks. They usually do that a couple of weeks ahead of time. And then those of us, basically the way it works is anyone can create a topic and then anyone can join a topic. And then they set a time and you can meet in a location and then everyone gets to talk. I usually do them focused on Swarm just because that's what I like to talk about. There's always ones on Docker 101. There's ones on Kubernetes and stuff like that. So if you're able to get into one of those with me, and quite frankly, if it's full, just come anyway because they don't really limit the number of people. So, check that out and see if you can sign up, see if you can show up. I'll be there at least once. I do one of those. And then, of course, I do a DockerCon talk and I do a workshop. So you can see me there and try to catch me after those. But yeah, it can be a little tough because there's so many people there. And usually when you come off stage after speaking, there's usually a line of people that want to talk to you. So typically after a talk, I will have an hour's worth of people standing in line wanting to ask questions and stuff like that. So the better way to do it is the hallway track. You'll probably be able to spend some time there. And, I don't know everything. So what's great is in that group, if it's a Swarm-specific topic, the hallway tracks are a great way to get feedback from other people there because there are people there running much more Swarm infrastructure or Kubernetes infrastructure than I've ever run. So you're going to be able to do in hallway track what you couldn't maybe learn in a session, which is direct feedback from other people, right? So definitely check out the hallway tracks. I think it's one of the best things about going to DockerCon is the hallway track, and they keep improving it year after year. So check that out. Great question. Yeah, so Biker's saying, I see Portworx Kubernetes on their homepage. I think that's just due to marketing. I mean, everyone right now in the space is trying really hard to be the Kubernetes solution for something because it's a land, I call it a land grab, where everyone's trying to grab their little piece of the Kubernetes pie. And Swarm, even though Swarm and Kubernetes are both growing in usage, Kubernetes is growing at an exponential rate faster, so everyone's going after that money. The last I checked, their solutions worked with the Docker engine, and the Docker engine and the API really haven't changed. So, at some point they had a list, a pull down of different ways that they run it. So, yeah, check that out. You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, Biker says, our IT guys are nervous about setting experimental so we can get build squash, but need that to get rid of CVE scanning alerts from overridden layers. Any downside to having our build server use experimental? No, Biker. I think experimental is fine. To me, what experimental really means from Docker is it does not necessarily mean buggy and could cause it to crash. What experimental means is it's features that they have built, solid features, that they may change them. They may tweak them or change the command line, or they may not graduate, although I would totally expect that one to graduate because that one's used by a lot of people. So I wouldn't have any problem about it. Besides, it's one of those things where if you're talking about squishing an image, you're testing the images, right? So you're going to build the image, and you're going to test it. And then if it works in the testises, if it's going to work in testing, you're going to push that up to your registry. So you already are going to know that that image is valid and that the squash worked. So I would say do your squashing and all your stuff like that before you test it, and then you'll know. You'll know whether or not experimental is causing any problems. I personally have not seen that be an issue or cause problems, but I don't run it automated on a daily basis, so I may not be the best person to ask on that. One thing you can always do, though, is go to github.com/moby/moby and look in the issues, the open issues, and search for the keywords of things you're considering doing, right? If you're thinking about using an experimental feature, search for that feature in the GitHub issues. See if other people are having problems, because there's so many millions of people now using Docker that any problem really gets reported pretty quickly. And you can kind of tell if you're maybe trying to do something that's a little bit risky, or if other people are having problems with, or even if there is a problem and a fix, you can kind of see all that happening on GitHub in the open source issues. So I would recommend trying that out before you go full on production, just to be safe, right? Let's see, who's next? John says, do you know of a solution similar to Portworx? I was looking at something like Gluster FS. I would like your thoughts on this topic. Thank you in advance. Sure, if Gluster works for you, great. There's something called Ceph. It really depends on your requirements, what you're trying to do. I'm guessing that what you're wanting is data replication. And certainly those tools all have containers that you can try out. I am always nervous about using open source data replication tools in production. You cannot, by the way, use those tools to replicate databases. If you're talking about an open file, right, a database file or something that has a file open on a particular container, then you probably are not going to have a good solution for replicating it other than using that app itself. So most people think they can just replicate databases at the file level, and that's not usually going to give you the results you want. If you want true high availability, you want to do application-based replication using, SQL mirroring or, Mongo replicas or whatever the technology is for your data store. If you're really just wanting to copy static files, for example, blog uploads, a great example would be if you're running a blog and people upload images which are stored on the file system, and you want that in high availability format, you want those to be on every machine, and those are just images or flat files. They're not really open files. They're not databases. So you could definitely use a replication technology to do that. There are multiple ones out there, and Portworx is a nice paid one. So if I was running a business that was depending on that data, their money was involved in that, right? Then I would definitely be wanting to use a tool with some sort of support behind it, because data is the most important thing, right? If my servers crash, fine, as long as I kept my data safe. And so the way I normally do it is I use shared storage. I use off-server storage. I don't normally replicate my storage, but that's just because I haven't had a strong need to do that. And so you can use file shares like EFS on Amazon, the EFS solution, which gives you a shared directory that allows multiple servers to talk to it all at the same time, stuff like that. But certainly check out Ceph. I can't even say it. Ceph, CEPH. That is a little bit more complicated and but it does work in containers, and you can look at other things. There's also, you can look up Ceph versus Gluster, stuff like that. Check those out. All right. Hopefully that helped. And it looks like we've come to the end of the questions, which is fantastic because we just hit an hour. So unless you have last minute questions, get those in really quick while I wrap it up. But I'll answer one more question if somebody can throw it in quick. But otherwise, I will see you here next week. If you have not subscribed, click the bell so that you get notified when I go live, because coming in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to have some guests, and we're possibly going to make some announcements, and possibly even something to give away, as well as maybe even simultaneously broadcasting to other channels here on YouTube with bigger names in them. So thanks for hanging out. Thanks for learning with me, and I will see you next week here on YouTube Live.